So, to this evening's talk, I'm delighted to introduce Stephen Boyce-Smith. This talk is one of a series that we have been holding jointly with the Asiatic Society, and we're very grateful for the use of this expanded room. Stephen is, I would say, an independent researcher, but let me just give you a bit of a flavour of his background. So he had a distinguished career in the British Civil Service, particularly in the Home Office, and if I look down the list, he was Principal Private Secretary to the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland, and a few years later to the Home Secretary. He was Director General in the Home Office, Head of the Police Department, Head of the Department responsible for Immigration, Asylum and Nationality, and finally Head of the Department responsible for policy on counter-terrorism, organised crime and drugs. And after he retired, he did a number of reviews for the government and was appointed a companion of the Bar in 2001. But he's not here to talk about that, I hope. But to talk about Thomas Sandwith, a British Levant Consul, and Stephen has written a book, and I think he'll be drawing on his book to tell us all about Thomas Sandwith. Stephen, thank you very much for coming this evening. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Quentin, for that introduction. What I'm going to do this evening is to talk about Britain in the Levant. Not British, but Britain, official Britain. And I'm going to do so, as that suggests, through consular eyes, as seen through the reporting and experience of Thomas Sandwith. I'm going to start briefly looking at the Levant Consular Service. Then I will move on to summarise, again fairly briefly, Sandwith's career, not because you want a biography. I'm certainly not going to terrify you by taking you through a 600-page book. And I will try and draw a few examples from that career. But mainly what I want to do is to take some themes through consular eyes and see what they meant to him, both in what he wrote to the Foreign Office and the Ambassador, and in the experiences he had in various places around the land. And, hang on, just the left one. Got it. Now, this is about Britain in the Levant. I'm unashamedly and unapologetically going to use some Eurocentric terms, of which the Eastern question is the first. Just as, in this book, I avoided all those problems that authors have in their forwards, identifying which kind of spelling they're going to use. I simply use the spelling that Sandwith used, or the names that Sandwith used for places where he served. The Eastern question, the issue, the diplomatic issue that preoccupied British governments throughout most of the 19th century. Its features, as Sandwith started in 1855, in the middle of the Crimean War, which was all about the Eastern question. In his final post, 1891, as Consul General in Odessa, Russian expansion was again the core issue and the thing that most took his attention. Sandwith's career coincided with this preoccupation, just as it coincided with the second half of the 19th century with a period of the zenith, you might say, of British assertiveness and self-confidence, not only in the Levant, but certainly in the Levant. Now, let me go on and look at Levant consuls against that kind of background. Firstly, the Levant Consular Service and its roots. The Levant Company was established in 1592 in London, combining a Turkey and a Venice company of the previous decade. For the virtually the first century of its existence, the Levant Company appointed British ambassadors in Constantinople. Throughout its existence, until it was wound up by legislation in 1825, the Levant Company appointed the consuls and vice-consuls. And those people, therefore, almost inevitably, invariably, were both merchants in the place in which they were serving, as well as consuls. Is this all right on, or is something there to explain? No. I think it's me moving the house. After 1825, when the Levant Company was wound up, there was a big expansion in the number of Levant consuls. When Sandwith joined 30 years later, there were 41 consuls, 3 consuls general, and innumerable vice-consuls in the Ottoman Empire alone. And this was a far greater consular presence than in any other part of the world. These consuls, moreover, had very different functions, or additional functions, to those elsewhere in the world. They were, as I describe them here, the eyes, ears, and instruments of Britain's preoccupation with the Eastern question. They often intervened in events. They were reporting not only on things like trade, typical consular business, but above all, reporting as political agents on political events. And in that sense, although they were in some ways akin to the Far Eastern consuls, they were unlike consuls elsewhere. Now, these people were different also in that, for example, they learnt the local languages. Sandwith was fluent in Turkish, fluent in modern Greek, albeit that he built it on the classical language that he'd learned as a young man. He acquired some Arabic. I wish my written French was as good as his written French, and he certainly could read Italian. And in his retirement, travelling in Egypt, he amazed people he had met that he could converse with them once on a train and once on a boat in Arabic, in Turkish and in Arabic. Now, these consuls intervened. To give an atypical example of an intervention in events by Sandwith, but one that I think sort of illustrates the assertiveness with which Britain used to act in those days. When he was consul in Crete, as he was for 15 years, during the Balkan crisis, which I'll talk a bit about in a few moments, fearful that the tensions that were growing between the Christian community in Crete and the Ottoman authorities, on several occasions, he got the captain of a Royal Naval ship moored in Suda Bay, not far from the capital, Hania, to sail, no doubt making a lot of smoke, up and down along the northern coast of Crete, opposite the 3 towns of Hania, Rethymnon, and as it's now called, but not by Sandwith, Iraklon. And he reported afterwards to the Foreign Office what a wonderful effect the sight of the Royal Navy had. Everybody calmed down. They knew that they might get shades, perhaps current events. They might get a rather brisk intervention if they disregarded the Royal Navy just a few miles offshore. That said, these people are seldom noticed. Consuls weren't fashionable. They never attracted the aristocratic or the wealthy. they increasingly became middle class as the trend grew to appoint British people rather than local people to the consular service. I call them the unsung infantry because although their dispatches have been extensively mined, they aren't noticed. They've been mined by historians for what they can say about the areas in which they've served. But more than that, they are unsung and unnoticed. And yet, what they were was the British government's infantry at ground level, on the ground, reporting and informing and enabling the government and the ambassador to build policy in the light of what was actually happening, and providing the Foreign Office and the ambassador with instruments on the ground with which they could, if necessary, intervene. And that naval incident in Crete is one. And that was an intervention that he made without seeing any need to refer to London or the ambassador, and without telling the governor of Crete in advance. He just did it, and felt totally at ease in doing it, which gives you some sense of the self-confidence with which Britain and its agents were able to act in those days. And in anticipation of another theme I want to touch on, it is important to understand that after 1825, increasingly, the view spread in Britain that it was important to employ as consuls and vice-consuls. I'm not talking of support staff, the dragonans and ambassadors, but as consuls and vice-consuls, people who had a real connection to Britain. And I shall come on and explore that a little bit more. But gradually, and Sandwith is an example of this 30 years after the demise of the Levant Company, is an example of the way in which British people were brought out, instead of, as used to be the case under the company, the appointment, for the most part, if not invariably, of people with roots in the Levant and appointed by the company because of those roots. Now, let's move on a little, firstly, to his roots. He came from a Methodist and medical family in Yorkshire. On the left is Bridlington, I must admit, a little after he was born there, but that's where he was born. A family that valued education for at least the male offspring, and he went to good schools, and he ended up here at St Catherine's College, Cambridge, in the early 1850s. In 1855, facilitated by his elder brother, who was already at the Levant, Humphrey, better known man, Humphrey Sandwith, he went out to work in an unofficial and unpaid capacity, all perfectly legitimate and normal in those days, for a man who called James Henry Skene, who had been for a while a vice-consul in Constantinople, but as Sandwith, just before Sandwith left, had been appointed as consul, full consul in Aleppo. Sandwith went out to work as his unpaid assistant, but he didn't get to Aleppo any more than Skene did at that time, because one of the better known stories of better stories but lesser known for the Crimean War is the English employment of the so-called Bashir-Bazouks, Turkish irregular light cavalry, paid for and officered by the British, recruited from a large area around the Ottoman Empire, in which, just as Sandwith was leaving, a crisis developed over their apparent disorders where they were based in the Dardanelles. Skene was sent by the ambassador to Stratford to Redcliffe to try and sort this out. Sandwith joined him there and spent 3 months in the Dardanelles alongside what became a sort of cause célèbre and a famous scandal. He then stayed with the Bashir-Bazouks, renamed as they were the Osmanli Irregular Cavalry, and spent a miserable winter of 1855 in Bulgaria, just inland from Varna, doing nothing, because this irregular cavalry never saw action, and stayed there with them until the war wound up with the Treaty of Paris in the spring of 1856. And I offer you this picture of the Crimea, not because it was like that in any way when Sandwith went, dare I say, sailed east. And indeed, he didn't reach the Crimea. But this is the Cathcart Hill, where the British Crimean War memorials were gathered together some time after the war, which, when he was in Odessa, was one of his responsibilities to make sure that they were properly cared for. Something on which the Treasury was prepared to spend money, whereas quite often he wasn't prepared to spend much. In 1857, Sandwith went with scheme to Aleppo, eventually, his post. He quite quickly was appointed to 2 unpaid vice-consular posts in places that were important and historic and sizable, but almost unknown to the British. As Sandwith said, in Tab, Gaziantep now, and also to Marash. He was there 4 years without any pay. In some way he must have relied on his family. The only income he got was from the few fees that were levied by the Consular, £5 or £6 a year. In 1861, he entered the consular service properly in his first salaried post in Haifa as vice-consul. That, a town that in those days was small, dirty, and to an educated person, lonely and frankly very unappealing. Mount Carmel that rose above Haifa, here because in his considerable leisure hours there wasn't much work to do, although there were some, and there were some difficult issues. He used to explore them, a man long interested in natural history and majestic. He lasted throughout his life. Now, before he could go to Haifa, he was suddenly diverted. Firstly, to join the staff of the British representative on the International Commission that the European powers had forced on the Sultan after, Eurocentric again, the massacres of Christians in Damascus in 1860. He served in that capacity for about 9 months, witnessing there both, and I shall discuss this later, intense Anglo-French rivalry, but also witnessing a very good example of how the European powers bullied the Sultan, because the International Commission that was set up was a supreme example of that. He then was diverted again before going to Haifa and had 6 months in Damascus as acting consul, where, as he was to find in Haifa when he eventually got there in 1862, he was to find that the Ottoman grip on Syria outside the town was pretty flimsy, and there were a lot of disorders in the area around Damascus, just as there were around Haifa. Now, he was in Haifa until 1865. He was then promoted to a bigger post, but still as a vice-consul, in Cyprus. And in those days, the consuls, just as the main commercial centre was Larnaca, the administrative government, the Ottoman authorities were in Nicosia, an 8-hour mule ride away from Larnaca. And this is the quayside in Larnaca in those days. Sandwith's house was, and the consulate office, they were combined, was somewhere along there. Cyprus then was a bit of a backwater. Nobody paid much attention to it in Europe. It mattered to the Ottomans mainly because it produced a big surplus of money, in contrast to Sandwith later found in Crete, which cost the Ottoman authorities a great deal more than they won from it in taxes. But Cyprus was highly profitable to the Ottoman exchequer. And there he started to show, as he hadn't really in Haifa, a trade that I have to say, having read coming on to 3,000 of his dispatches at the Foreign Office papers to write this book, he displayed a readiness sometimes to use a colourful phrase. He got to understand the distinctions between the effective officials and the honest ones, and those who were the opposite. And he didn't mince his words. If he found somebody failed to meet the standards that he thought were right, or if policy, as implemented, was not, in his view, satisfactory. And in a mega dispatch he sent on taxation in Cyprus, he talked of a careless and vicious administration. In Crete, he was to show the same trait, both in being close to some of their officials and being very distasteful of others. Take a few more quotes here. Of one of the Ottoman governors of Crete in his next post, he talked of the man with a display of religious bigotry in dealing with Cretan Christians. Another, feeble and arbitrary. And at one point, during the Balkan crisis, he said, as long as the Porte entrusts the government of this island to men so destitute of administrative tact as the present governor and his predecessor, there can be no hope of Crete remaining long in a state of tranquility. Crete then, where he spent virtually half his career on promotion to consul, 1870 to 1885. And you have here, some of you are perhaps familiar with the scene, this is the harbour in Hanyang, the capital. The British consulate was behind the mosque that still sits there, and if you'd arrived in the 1870s and 80s, you would have seen the building. The modern ones were the result of the replacement of what was bombed in 1941. You would have seen the British consulate with a very tall flagpole and the Union Jack flying proudly above the mosque, almost as if the flagpole appeared from the mosque, or a little way down. In Crete, using his Greek, he dug himself well in, he became well known, he got around, he used to travel a lot, taking his tent, and usually a couple of mules, and got both close to Ottoman officials and the leaders of the Christian community. And he was, as far as I can establish, but I can't prove, very unusual, certainly in Crete and I think elsewhere, in having both Greek and Turkish. Some Ottoman and senior Ottoman officials spoke French, and he could use that with them if they did. He could speak to them in Turkish, he could speak to the Christian community in Greek, and indeed Greek, in contrast to Cyprus, Greek was the language of both the Muslim and the Christian communities in Crete, unlike Cyprus, where the Muslim community generally spoke Turkish, and the Orthodox community Greek. Now, his main contribution in Crete was during the Balkan crisis of 1875 to 78, the Eastern Christian Rising again, in which he played an important part. There had been an enormous rebellion and rising in Crete, 1866 to 69, which had led to huge suffering, starvation, destruction of villages, but resulted in only fairly minor changes to the constitutional arrangements conceded by the Porte, the constitutional arrangements as they applied in Crete. During the Balkan crisis, there was a real fear, and Sandwith shared this, that there would be another rising, as there had been in 1866 to 69. If there had been, Crete would have been one of the focal points of European diplomacy, as it had been in the late 60s. It didn't happen. Sandwith put this down to two reasons. One was the memories of the suffering of 1866 to 69 on the part of the Christian community. The other was, as he put it, their good sense in realizing that unless they had what they hadn't had before, namely the support of European powers to gain something that they wanted, whether it was independence or, for most, union with the Kingdom of Greece, they were never going to win. And indeed, they were never going to win. And European powers, not wishing further to weaken the Ottoman Empire, were opposed to it, including Britain. Opposed not only to union and independence, but also opposed to what Sandwith on several occasions was asked for. Gnarled, hardened, tough Christian leaders came to see him on more than one occasion, people who'd been involved in the revolt of the 60s, to ask him to persuade the British government to take Crete over as a protectorate. He knew that that was not a starter, and he had to say no, much to their disappointment. But there would have been widespread Christian support had they decided to do that. There was no question there. Now, let's say he was there for 15 years. He then moved on as full consul to Crete, to Tunis, I beg your pardon. This is a picture from, as he would have looked when he was there, what by then, because it was from 1881, a French protectorate, and the French renamed this great gate, originally in the walls of the city, opposite the Consular, as La Porte de France. When he was there, and I'll come back to this in due course, he played a significant part in establishing decent working relations with the fairly newly arrived French authorities. Protectorate in 1881, he arrived in 1885. But against the background that in 1882, Britain had invaded Egypt and taken it over. Ostensibly they were going to leave quite quickly, but of course they didn't, and they were still there in the following century. And therefore a background where the French, although the British and French over Egypt acted cooperatively to start with, as sometimes happened in the early Third Republic, France was politically frozen and its navy was out of the Mediterranean, but then unable to act. It was the Royal Navy that bombarded Alexandria and the British regiments who invaded on their own, unaccompanied by the French. And for example, the leading French official in Tunis when he was there, recognised that this had been an enormous setback for French diplomacy in the Levant. Now, here we are. His time in Tunis was successful. He established good relations, impressed the Foreign Office, and he was by then, particularly after his time in Crete, which I'll talk about more, one of the senior Levant consuls. He was promoted to Consul General, one of the very few Consul General posts, and sent to Odessa. Here are the famous steps that had been put up about 50 years before he arrived. Now, he had an enormous area to cover, the modern Ukraine, including the Crimea, the modern Moldova, considerable areas beyond what we now call Ukraine, and also such tenuous consular cover as the British had right through to Baku on the Caspian Sea. It was an enormous geographical area, but the post was a huge anticlimax. And this brings out the distinction between Levant consuls and consuls in the British service elsewhere. He had no serious political function. He did comment on some political issues, and the one that really got him going, and he had some very robust things to say, was official and popular anti-Semitism in Odessa and Kiev and the other cities he was responsible for. The only significant new task that he had, in addition to the traditional trade and so on of any consul, was reporting. Eastern question raises its head again, reporting on Russian military activity. And throughout his 3 years in Odessa, there was a steady trickle of reports back to London that went on to the War Office and Admiralty Intelligence Departments about the movement of Russian troops, or building of barracks, and things of that kind. And in 1890, there was a real scare that the Russians were going to launch an attack, not this time on the Turks, but down towards, dare I mention, India. They had already taken large areas of Central Asia. A concern so acute that Lord Salisbury, who was at that point both Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, took a very close personal interest in it. Elaborate arrangements were made. Special ciphers were set up because they knew that the Russians would look at any telegram and flash into their wires. Ciphers were set up with special groups of capital letters that would indicate some kind of unit or some place or some activity. And we know that Salisbury took a close interest in this because he was the first Foreign Secretary to do what, when I was in the Home Office, was still the custom in the Home Office and other departments headed by a Secretary of State. Only the Secretary of State in the whole office may use red ink. And Salisbury was the first Foreign Secretary to adopt the red ink habit. And you can see his S on the backs of Sandwith's dispatches as they flowed in. Everybody else, Granville, Tarrant, and previous Foreign Secretaries, always in black. So Salisbury had some impact on events. Now, one other thing, in Tunis, and we all appreciate the way in which, by the end of the 19th century, Britain was facing greater economic competition. In Tunis, Sandwith had noted that the French, the Belgians, and the Germans were increasingly making inroads into what had been virtually a British monopoly, selling, Sandwith's term, Manchester goods, i.e. cotton, thread, and cotton cloth. In Odessa, Britain still at that time had the majority of the world's carrying trade. 60% of the steamers in Odessa, carrying 70% of the tonnage, were British. Tonnage carried all around the world, mainly grain from the Ukraine. Britain's main export to the Ukraine was coal. The port from which more ships arrived in Odessa than any other port in the world was Cardiff. And those here who remember Thomas the Tank Engine will recall that Welsh coal was the coal that really fired the engines more effectively in the views of the, I know it's unpolitical, incorrect, the fat controller than any other kind of coal he purchased. But he also witnessed the competition that was coming. The Russians were opening coal mines in the Donets. They were building east-west railway lines that enabled it to be brought in, and increasingly he saw the competition, together with import duties, that were restricting British coal imports. So again, you see him demonstrating the way in which the world was catching up, the world's economy was catching up with Britain. Now, one other thing I want to mention. He was an educated man. In Cyprus, as Vice-Consul in the second half of the 60s, but particularly in the latter part of that period, he and some of the other consuls and some other people there started to take a close interest in the archaeology of the island and started to dig and recover objects. I can't now tell that story, and the activities were amateur, there was no science of archaeology, they were ill-documented and rather haphazard. But out of it came a study that Sandwith made of the dating of ancient Cypriot pottery that he was encouraged by somebody he'd come into contact with, a man called Charles Newton, who was head of the Department of Greek and Roman Antiquities of the British Museum. He was encouraged by Newton to publish, and it was, in due course, published. Now, one modern expert on Cyprus considers that this was a very original piece of work, and it encapsulated it in terms that it was the basis on which subsequent attempts to date the ancient artifacts of Cyprus were built, which is quite an achievement for somebody who'd only come in as an amateur. I want to come back to another aspect, Sandwith's interest in archaeology at the end of the talk, namely when he was in Crete. Now, Levantines, the Levantine Heritage Foundation, I'm here under their auspices. I thought we'd just be a little bit spiky and have a look at this term through consular eyes to describe a little about how the British used the term and viewed the people. And you will find that not everything was entirely favourably seen. And important to remember that what I'm about to say was not something unique to the Consular service. A similar phenomenon where an increasingly disdainful view was taken of the local inhabitants had already, and William Dalrymple has written about this, had already been happening in India. And the British in the late 19th century were famously disdainful of foreigners of any kind. But as far as Sandwith is concerned, it was Levantines. Now let me give you a few remarks. This is Skene, the consul he went out to work with, writing from Aleppo a few months after he arrived in 1857. He spoke in a dispatch to the Foreign Office of the repeated proofs of the evils arriving from the employment of natives, meaning people born, whether with British links or not, in the Levant, the kind of person whom the Levant company had always appointed, or virtually always appointed as consuls. And the Foreign Office came back in these terms. Lord Clarendon, he was the Foreign Secretary, Lord Clarendon would approve of British subjects being everywhere appointed to vice-consular posts instead of natives, if that could be done without costing too much. And you are at liberty to recommend British subjects in lieu of the natives at present holding the posts to which you allude. In other words, sack the locals. A few years later, when he was in Cyprus, Sandwith was going to go on leave. He didn't often have leave. They usually took long leave when they did. He'd been 5 years in Syria before he ever went home. But he had another session of leave from Cyprus and needed to appoint someone to act as vice-consul in his absence. And he proposed that he should appoint his chief dragoman, who was a highly educated, indeed intellectual Greek, who had been partly educated in Britain and was therefore fluent in both languages. He was a collector of antiquities, and I think the British Museum is represented at the back of the room, but I think I'm right in saying that some of the things that he collected are still in the cases that Thomas looks after. And he proposed that this man should act as consul. Back came the reply from his boss: I have great objection to a native being placed in charge of so important a vice-consul. So instead, Sandwith had to find a merchant who was operating in London, who knew nothing about consular work but was British, to take over the work. Here is Sandwith writing from Crete a year or so after he arrived, commenting on the attitude, as he perceived it, that the Ottoman authorities took towards Levantines. He said that they look on Levantines, by which I mean residents of foreign extraction, in pretty much the same light as an Englishman does. And an Englishman, in those days, meant also a Scot, a Welshman, or an Irishman. As an Englishman does, i.e. as persons of no national attachment, or very high sense of honour, and who serve their adopted country from motives of self-interest. A few years later in Crete, the French consul went on leave, and during the Balkan crisis, and Sandwith noted that the French consulate wasn't operating on cylinders, and he put this down to the fact that the acting consul for France was, I quote, a Levantine from Smyrna. Natural-born Englishmen were what increasingly the Foreign Office, public opinion in Britain, and parliamentarians wanted. In 1858, just some parliamentarians had said in a report to the government, with this in view, your committee would impress upon the government the advantage of restricting the consular function as far as possible to British subjects. Now, it wasn't only the consular service that was taking this line, any more than it was just in Levant. Thackeray made a famous journey that he wrote up in a book from Cornhill to Grand Curragh, a journey he made in the 1840s when, at one point, he mocked a feeble-aged, dare I say, Levantine consul in Jaffa. And he went on to say the greatest number of our Levant consuls, with those days were still mainly those appointed by the Levant company before 1825, are paid at a similar rate of easy remuneration. If we have bad considerations, have we any right to complain? If the worthy gentleman cheat occasionally, can we reasonably be angry? a man called Madden, who travelled in the 1820s with Levant and again wrote at great length about his travels. He commented on this same vice consul in Jaffa, who's been there 20 years earlier than Thackeray, described him as a miserable Levantine, attired in Syrian costume, but with an old-fashioned English cocked hat, of which he was excessively vain. And on a vice consul in Sidon, Madden said, a miserable object with famine in his looks. Now, a wonderful and indeed tolerant book, Alexander King makes Eothen, I think it's one of the great travel books. He mocked the Levantine consular agent in Paphos on Cyprus, who, when Kinglake arrived, was to be received with a proper dinner, and he mocked the consul for rushing around in hen coop with a club, trying to bonk a few chickens on the head and not being very successful at it. More seriously, Robert Pashley, Oxford academic who wrote two very important and weighty volumes on Crete in the mid-1830s, compared the poor quality of the British representatives in Crete with those of France, who were French and had come from France. And it was enough for him to say that the English representatives were totally unacquainted with English. Henry Layard, excavator, politician, ambassador in Constantinople when Sandwith was in Crete during the Balkan crisis, thought that there was widespread corruption among locally employed consuls. Edmund Hornby, in charge of the Supreme Consular Court in Constantinople, wrote of great abuses by men who were English only in name. And a statistician giving a lecture, probably not terribly far from here in London, on the population of the Ottoman Empire in 1865, and discussing at one point medical services in the Ottoman Empire. Many of the doctors who worked around the Levant were Italian, but he described the doctors as vagabond Europeans, or illiterate Armenians or Greeks with hats on. Now, one task that I didn't mention and must draw your attention to is that Levant consuls, unlike those in the rest of the world, operated what were called capitulations. This was a system conferred by the Ottoman authorities, first Genoa in the 15th century, Britain's followed in the 16th century, whereby the consul had criminal and civil jurisdiction over his own nationals, who did not appear before Ottoman courts, but appeared before the consul. And the Consulate General in Constantinople had a prison attached. On the ground floor of the consulate in Hanya, behind that mosque, was a lockup. And many of the people that were drawn to the attention of the consuls for criminal purposes were either Maltese citizens, because Malta had become British in 1814, or between 1814 and 64, when Britain had protectorate over the Ionian Islands, were, as was said at the time, Ionians. And once the Ionian Islands were passed over to the Kingdom of Greece in 1864, the capitulation workload of consuls right around the Levant fell very sharply. And just one final example. Antonio von Tiziano, vice consul in Crete from 1799 to 1838. A man, therefore, who was so appointed by the company and survived the company demise. He died in post in 38, as I say, at the age of 75. And successive visitors to Cyprus ridiculed him for his vanity, above all for wearing his consular uniform. They all had uniforms in those days. For wearing his consular uniform to home when he received his visitors. Now, this is the important point, not just the attitude that the British were taking, but after his death in 1838, an Englishman was sent out. This was a mark of the change. An Englishman was sent out with very clear instructions from the Foreign Office He had to get a grip on the post, make it a professional operation, keep proper archives, make timely returns to London, and all the rest. And Sandwith fits that model as an educated Brit and not as a Levanter. Now, let's have an antidote to that, slavery. Whereas the discussion of Levantines is an example of British exclusivity, slavery was the opposite. On slavery, once it had abolished the trade itself, Britain, through the Royal Navy mainly, took a leading role in trying to prevent the slave trade. And had, among other things, lent very heavily on the Sultan and his government to bring a stop to the slave trade as it affected the Ottoman Empire. And in the Ottoman Empire, slavery was a very different institution from what we typically picture of the Caribbean and the United States. It was smaller, people were frequently freed, some of the freed slaves rose to very high positions. They were mainly in domestic or, in some cases, in agricultural work. But nevertheless, the institution was deeply embedded in the Ottoman system. Under mainly British pressure, the public slave market in Constantinople was closed in the mid-1840s. In 1857, again, similar pressure, the Sultan undertook, this was the first flush after the Crimean War, the period of reform, allies very influential, undertook to prevent the trade from the Persian Gulf and from Africa. And some steps were taken, but they were only partially successful. Now, the British were somewhat two-faced about this, because neither Britain nor the European countries intervened and tried to do anything to stop the slave trade, which was mainly female and mainly for domestic purposes, whatever domestic may be, from Circassia to particularly Constantinople. And in 1870, an important but much hidden report prepared with the ambassador, by his staff, prepared for the ambassador, noting in Constantinople, noted this dichotomy, and went on to say that although there were, as indeed there were, leading Ottoman reformers who undertook to prevent the slave trade, they themselves bought and sold slaves for domestic purposes, that is to say, females from Circassia. Sandwith encountered slavery in three different ways. In Cyprus, slavery existed. It was an institution, people owned, mainly Muslim families, but not only. But apparently, perhaps because it was tucked away in the corner of the East Mediterranean, Cyprus didn't experience the trade. And the Foreign Office asked for returns from right round the Levant, all the consuls, in 1869, about the slave trade, and nil returned from Cyprus. It was completely different in Crete. There was no slave owning, but the slave trade from Africa on the way to Constantinople did touch the island. In 1873, working with one of the Ottoman governors of Crete that he greatly admired, he suspected that there were slaves on a ship bringing the retiring Governor-General of Tripoli back to Constantinople, got the Governor-General to intervene. He got all the Africans off the boat, decided that some were part of the Governor-General's establishment, to use the term, and the rest were free. But that was very exceptional, and it was very hard for consuls to know what was happening, because the ship moored to refuel or to restock for food and water in Hania Harbour, there was very little that they could do to find out what was happening, so to speak, in their days. Things changed in 1880 when there was a further British-Turkish convention which obliged the Sultan to take more robust steps to prevent the trade and allowed the ships of one country to intervene if they were suspicious and board the ships of another. In 1883, another incident where a ship arrived in Hania, Sandwith persuaded the Governor-General to Act and trying to find a way of stopping this. He proposed, and the ambassador and the Foreign Office agreed, that if there were any suspicions, people should be taken off the ship in question, detained, and only allowed to go on a later ship, not with those people, if they were thought to be legitimate rather than as slaves. The Port was very difficult about implementing this, and he left Crete for his next post in Tunis with this comment in one of his, almost his last dispatch. He said that if the Port cared to put a stop to the traffic in slaves between its African possessions and Constantinople, then detaining them at any port of call or route will be one of the most effectual means to that end. That he left before he knew the outcome. Finally, in Tunis had been governed by beys on a very long and elastic strip, although they were technically part of the Ottoman Empire, they weren't effectively controlled. And the Bey of Tunis had abolished the slave trade in 1841 and given full emancipation in 1846. So there was no slavery when Sandwith arrived there in the mid-80s, because the French were there in any case, but there were little signs of its continuing, not least in the Bey's own extended family. And he had a few run-ins with the French, and used sometimes to find that in one of the consular offices there were several vice-consular posts down the Tunisian east coast, that people would turn up seeking protection from the British authorities. And in his first 4 months, he gained ammunition for 6 people who had turned up in that kind of way, claiming that they were still kept in slavery and seeking their freedom. But essentially, it wasn't a big issue. Now, let's take another issue through Sandwith's eyes, Anglo-French rivalry. The Crimean War, of course, had ostensibly been a period of intense Anglo-French cooperation, seeking to prevent the Russians damaging the Ottoman Empire, although there were many jealousies and rivalries and tensions between those two countries during the course of the war. Syria said he joined the staff of the British representative on that international commission set up after the massacre of Christians in Damascus in 1860. The core issues that that commission debated, ostensibly and indeed actually, about the future arrangements for the government of what we would call the Lebanon, were a fight between the French and the British. The French had long had links to the Lebanon and that area, particularly to the Maronite Christians, and the British, to counterbalance that, had traditionally sided with the Druze. But the main struggle in the commission was between those two representatives, and when the initial report was taken to Constantinople to be fought out between the ambassadors there, it was whether or not there should be a separate province for the Maronite area. And the British were deeply opposed to that for no other reason, not because it meant bad government in the Lebanon, it wouldn't have been practical, but simply because the French would have had too big an influence in that area. And in the end, the British won. Now Cyprus. Cyprus was a backward as far as most European countries were concerned, and indeed, as far as the port was concerned, except for the taxable revenue that it gained. As I said, I think much more was earned from Cyprus than was spent there, in contrast to Crete, as Sandwith was to find out, when exactly the opposite. Much more was spent in Crete by the Ottoman authorities than was gained in taxes. In Cyprus, there had been some tensions, and the French, being statist in a way the British never were, had set up schools. It had mounted a scientific expedition in Cyprus that produced a very important volumes on the economy, the agriculture, the natural history, the geology of the island. It had also occasionally diverted French merchant ships to Cyprus, simply to have a French merchant ship calling. Now, the British were parsimonious, and they were laissez-faire, and they did none of that. And indeed, little tensions erupted while he was there. The French consul at the time noted that at last English ships were coming more frequently than French ones. The British were pushing the French aside. There were big tensions, but signs of the of the differences. Now, in Tunis, as I said, he arrived in 1885. The French had taken it over as a protectorate with British connivance, and indeed active support. The famous words that Salisbury spoke to the French Foreign Minister at the Congress of Berlin in 1878. Prenez Tunis, Carthage ne doit rester aux barbares. In Tunis there have been long differences between French consuls and the British. The French had gained the upper hand back in the late 17th century with a treaty that put the French consul ahead of all the other foreign representatives. And indeed the French consul used to offer protection to nationals of Catholic European countries, but not to the Protestant Dutch or British. Most of those tensions were working out, but the fact that he was there so soon after the British occupation of Egypt meant that life was always a bit tense and a bit difficult. There were, for example, occasion over Maltese people having their land compulsory purchased for purposes the French authorities then wanted to implement in Tunis. Sandwith persuaded the Foreign Office to wheel out the ambassador in Paris to go to the Quai d'Orsay to say, up with this we will not put. He was sufficiently persuasive, and fresh instructions came back from Paris to the French resident minister under the protectorate, and policy was changed as a result. So there were tensions, but what I want to look at particularly is Bizerta, a 50 square mile inland lake right up in the northeast corner of Tunisia, connected to the sea by a narrow canal. If we may take the comment of Lord Granville, who was Foreign Secretary at the time in 1881, he noted that the French, if they were taking over as they were then, might be able to establish a naval base impregnable by a naval force and this was the key, neutralising Malta. And Britain then, in 1881, hadn't yet got Egypt. It didn't have Alexandria. Malta was its most eastern Mediterranean naval base, and a very powerful one. A commentator in the year that Sandwith arrived said that the French could convert the lake into a great naval depot from which men of war may steam out at any moment and completely block this narrow part of the Mediterranean, nullifying our advantage in holding Malta. Sandwith went a good many times to Bizerta to inspect what was happening. Sometimes there seemed to be efforts to deepen the canal, sometimes to widen it. And he heard of plans to dig a separate canal to enable bigger ships to come into the Mediterranean to this inland lake. And his reports back to London were instantly copied by the Foreign Office onto the Admiralty, to the War Office, and the embassies in Rome and Paris. In fact, while he was there, nothing much happened on the ground, although in 1887, the Royal Navy, prompted partly by his reports, held what were called secret manoeuvres off the north coast of Africa, designed expressly to test their capacity to prevent a French fleet, either from Toulon or the Atlantic, reaching the North African coast. Now, as I say, nothing really happened on the ground. It was 1896 before they established a naval base, by which time Sandwith was non-retired. The 1890s represent the nadir of Anglo-French relations, prompted particularly by events in Africa, the so-called Eurocentric again, scramble for Africa, involved major tensions between those two countries. But there would have changed by then. It's an example of the way in which people change their minds in the light of new facts. Firstly, in 1889, the British had imposed upon themselves, it would sound amazing to us now, a requirement to have a battleship strength equal to the battleship strength of its two nearest naval rivals combined, the US Navy writ large. And moreover, the Admiralty had changed its mind. it had decided that it would be easy to block the canal, however wide it was, so that the ships could either never get in or never get out, and those that were in would be readily unable to manoeuvre, would be readily bombarded by the sea. So the whole issue that trickled away. But in Sandwith's time, this was a key factor in the Anglo-French rivalry of these days. Now, technical change. The Ottomans imported technical know-how from around Europe. I offer you this pleasant picture, which again anybody who knows Hanyang will recognise as the lighthouse on the end of the mole in the harbour. Because it was operated not by the Ottoman authorities, but by a French company. It was privatised. Britain was a major factor in bringing to the Ottoman Navy expertise. It built the ships. Many of the engine rooms on Ottoman steam warships were manned by British sailors. British mechanics worked in the shipyards of Constantinople. British naval officers held senior positions, and indeed not only senior positions, in the Ottoman Navy. One example of this is the telegraph. The telegraph had not even reached Constantinople at the beginning of the Crimean War. The telegraph got to Varna, and then the steamer had to take the message all the way down to Constantinople. Urgent dispatches for the military went to London by steamer to Marseille, 6 days, and then by train through France. The telegraph started to arrive in the early 1860s, and the line was built down the Syrian coast from 1862, reached Beirut in 63, it reached Sandwith in Haifa in 1864, and on its way on to Alexandria. 61 and 2 was a line between Damascus and Beirut. He had, therefore, no telegraph in effect in Haifa. There was none in Cyprus. In those days, dispatches were not put in envelopes. They were sheets of wonderful Harrods quality paper, folded over several times and sealed to produce a package about that size. And on the outside of his, because the only steamer company regularly serving Cyprus was the Austrian Lloyd, would be written by Austrian post, and it would go to Trieste, and then through successive postal systems all the way up to London, which took a week or more. But in Crete, he did have telegraph, operated by the Eastern Telegraph Company, a British one, that did lines all the way from India to London. Run in Crete by English managers, and on a few occasions, but not many. It seems to me, reading between the lines of his dispatches, that he must have had a few leaks, presumably, from those English managers. In 1882, he reported the contents of a telegram from the Turkish Ministry of War to the Commander-in-Chief in Crete, and he gave a very full account of what was in the telegram. I mean, speculators that everybody's hands on it. I mentioned that he, Sandwith, had promoted the British mediation between the Ottoman authorities and the Christians during the Balkan crisis. Crete teetered on the edge of revolt for several years, but never quite got there for the reasons, at least as far as Sandwith is concerned, that I explained. The Russians nearly reached Constantinople in the spring of 1878. The Congress of Berlin sat in the summer of 1878, but Crete was still unsteady. And in May of that year, Sandwith proposed that the British should mediate between the two. Kissinger's type shuttle diplomacy on the island exercised by Sandwith between the Ottoman governor and his people and the Christian leaders ensued. And for example, his very first major meeting with the Christian leaders was at a village called Frey above Hanyang. Shades here of primary school for some of us. He had gone up with his tent. He sat on a chair outside his tent, and all these hardened leaders of the Christians, who by then controlled the countryside of Crete. Only the towns were then under Ottoman control, sat on the ground in front of it. Primary school memories: on a hot summer's afternoon, the teacher, as a special treat, would take you outside and let you have a lesson on the glass outside the window. But this operation in Crete only worked because he could operate hand in glove with Henry Layard, the ambassador in Constantinople, and he did that by telegraph. He might, indeed a telegram was brought up to him while he was at Frey. If he needed to try and shift the position of the Ottoman authorities on the island, or if he wanted to see whether certain ideas that he had or that the Christians had were or were not likely to be acceptable in Constantinople to the court, he telegraphed constantly with Leon. And although I can't say that it would not have been a pact of Khalifa, the one that settled in October 78, that settled Crete for the last 20 years of its under direct Ottoman rule, I'm absolutely convinced that without the telegraph, it would not have happened in those terms, and certainly would not have happened when it did, because it was a week, 10 days. If every time there was an exchange, he had to write to Layard had to go and see the court, and then write back, and the negotiations, the shuttle diplomacy would have run. Now, let me move on to archaeology as a final, and perhaps a lighter note on which to finish. I mentioned that you've been interested in archaeology in Cyprus. The same in Crete. Here you have a picture of the part of the site at Knossos, excavated initially by Arthur Evans starting in 1900. In Sandwith's time, nothing was known about Knossos at all. Some of you may have seen Andrew Chapman's brilliant exhibition at the Ashmolean on Evans and Knossos. And that brings out how the first person to seriously uncover things was a Greek, and indeed he was employed in the vice-consulate in Heraklion. Candia is Sandwith then appeared. Minos Kalokerinos. He did some digging in the latter part of 1878, uncovered a number of objects, but was persuaded by his fellow Greek Christians in Crete not to pursue it, for fear that anything he found would be exported to the museum in Constantinople, which was the last thing they, as Christian Cretans, wanted to happen. So he stopped. But the following spring, Sandwith, well, no, let me just say something else. Knossos, just to emphasize how little was known about Knossos before Kalokerinos dug up even those things. And all he did was to investigate a tiny corner of the site. Pashley, that man who wrote those two erudite volumes on Crete in the 1830s, spoke of this miserable hamlet and a few shapeless heaps of masonry. And he went on to say there was nothing worth looking at there. And nothing that was visible, such few things as were visible, were certainly not Minoan. And remember, there was no sense at all of the existence of Minoan civilization. The term itself was an invention of Arthur Evans. Edward Lear was there in the 1860s, and he spoke about little remaining, except some scattered brickwork. An Oxford geographer called Tozer visited Crete in 1874 when Sandwith was there, and went round the island and wrote eruditely later on the islands of the Aegean. But as far as Knossos was concerned, he said the ruins of that ancient capital, if so they can be called, for nothing but a single wall remains. None of that was known to exist at all. Accompanying Tozer was another Oxford don, bursar of Corpus Christi College, who kept a diary, sadly still unpublished. And he said this in his diary. One of the first questions asked with reference to Crete is, are there many ancient remains? The answer is, decidedly not. For, it must be remembered, historically, the interest of Crete is small. Now, a further picture of Knossos with one of Evans's grand reconstructions. No time to debate that now. Not long after, indeed the following spring, after Kallikerainos had found those few remains, Sandwith wrote to Charles Newton, the head of Greek and Roman Antiquities at the British Museum, and said it was very desirable, he knew Newton was coming to the Mediterranean, very desirable that Newton came to Crete. And he vividly described the site, which he personally, Sandwith, had visited, and described some of the things that Kallikerainos had found. And he went on to say to Newton that the ruins are likely to repay excavation. I think a visit would not be without interest to you. Now, Newton never came. This is one of the might have beens of archaeological history. What if he had come? Probably not much of an excavation, because the British Museum didn't have the funds. And Arthur Evans came along 2 decades later, supported by Dickinson Paper Company money, which is what made the Evanses rich. He had the energy, the insight, the enthusiasm, and the funds to buy the whole site and to support the excavation for decades. So nothing came of that. But, and this is a pithos that you will see from Knossos, that you will see in the British Museum and the Cretan remains, ground floor, front corridor. Unless Thomas's witnesses. In 1884, Kallikerainos offered one of the pithy that he found to the British Museum. Sandwith wrote to the British Museum, they accepted it, and it fell to Sandwith to arrange the transport. At that stage, the British Channel Squadron was serving in the role in the Mediterranean, commanded by the Duke of Edinburgh, and he came back in his flagship, which, with wonderful aptness, was Agent Minotaur. Now, the ancient, the modern, and the end. We have seen how Sandwith observed the juxtaposition of the old and the new, steamships and the telegraph, wooden ploughs and unmetal roads. It was constant comparison between the old and the new. In March 1900, Evans started digging. On the 10th of April, the Times had a report about his excavations, in which it said that there were important discoveries and a Mycenian building. A week later, on the 17th, much longer and above all much more exciting of remarkable discoveries, relics of extraordinary importance, and referring to a fresco, in brilliancy of colouring and grace of form, the figure surpasses anything hitherto discovered belonging to that period. Not, of course, that they understood what the period was or anything about its significance. Sandwith read the Times. It's nice to think that he might have felt, well, if my earlier intervention with Charles Newton had effect, some of the credit for that might have come my way. We don't know how he reacted, because on the 19th of April, where the ancient and the modern comes in. For the modern, he was out riding his newly acquired bicycle. He came to roadworks where a new water main was being dug. He fell off, and that most ancient of conveyances, a horse and cart, went over him, and he died 5 days later after a week of intense agony. Prematurely, he was over 69. And death, I think, is the right moment at which to stop. So through Consular eyes, an assertive, self-confident Britain, a two-faced one, because on the one hand, it was supporting the Ottoman Empire against the Russians, but then in 1878 it stole Cyprus, in 1882 it invaded Egypt, it supported the French taking over Tunis. Levantines and slavery, you see different attitudes of mind in both those discussions. But it was a consular heyday. They were the unsung infantry because they were there on the ground doing what the British government wanted, producing the information on which policy was produced. An unsung infantry, but I hope to have persuaded you through their eyes that they are a revealing infantry and what they say worth paying attention. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen, for an excellent talk. We had time for a few questions. If you are online, then could you put your questions in the chat and they will come to us somehow. But in the meantime, any questions from the audience here? Yes?
Yeah, what was the relationship between the Levant consuls and the Ottoman royal court? Did they have a good relationship?
Well, I think I'd like to say that the consuls, as consuls, didn't have any relationship with the Sultan's court in Constantinople because they were out in the provinces. They were operating with provincial governors on the ground. People who worked with the court in Constantinople were the ambassador and his staff. The relationship between consuls and the Ottoman authorities wherever they served, as I've sort of indicated, varied, and sometimes it was very close. Sometimes in Crete, for example, especially during the Balkan crisis, two of the highly effective governors of Crete at the time used to discuss with Sandwith what they might say back to the court. They would discuss options with them. So they were very unprofessionally revealing. Right. But that isn't always the case. And some of those people about whom, as I indicated, he was pretty rude. He had rather poor relations, but then I think all the other consuls did as well. But you must think of embassy to the court in Constantinople, consuls to the provincial governors, who turned over at an enormous rate. One of the well-established weaknesses of the Ottoman system of the late 19th century was the speed of turnover. When he was in Crete for 15 years, he worked with 14 governors. A crazy system. Nobody could get a grip on a complex job and do something about it if they were there for less than.
Under the capitulations, apart from British-born citizens, could local people get British consular protection?
Yes, some did. And some countries were more liberal with that than British were. French were, for example, in giving protection to people. There was a big protection case in Tunis when he was there, of people the Foreign Office greatly regretted they'd ever given protection to in the first place because they were extremely tiresome. But yes, they could, and the other people who had protection. And one of the attractions of working for a consulate was that the staff of the consulate also had protection from criminal, civil jurisdiction, and from taxation. So there were a lot of people who were unpaid assistants to the consuls. They were also likely, as Kavassis or Dragois, to be trading or business in some way or other, for whom this was a hugely attractive phenomenon. That man I mentioned in Cyprus, the one who was not allowed to become acting vice consul, was just such a position. He didn't have to pay the taxes because he worked for the Brits.
I have a question from the Zoom. Sue Kentish was watching. It says, very interesting talk, thank you. Please elaborate on British support of Bathsheba Zooks.
How long will we be here? The Bathsheba Zooks, the British in the early part of the Crimean War had employed Turkish irregular cavalry when the fighting was still on the Danube. The British ambassador, Lord Stratford de Ricke, was persuaded by a man called General Beatson, indeed he was only then Colonel Beatson, who had commanded irregular cavalry in India, that the British Army lacked regular cavalry and would benefit greatly if it could employ Turkish irregular cavalry. Stratford Irregular was taken by this. The Commander-in-Chief of the British Army thought it was all nonsense and remained with that view right through the Crimean War. But an influential man, the ambassador, persuaded the War Office and the Cabinet and the Foreign Office that this should be done. And I forget the numbers now, but early in 1855, a big recruitment campaign was mounted right around the Ottoman Empire to bring Bashi-Bazouks, irregular cavalry, to the Dardanelles at British expense, to be paid by the British and with the senior posts, British, under, as he then became, General Beatson. The row ensued, the one that drew Skene and therefore Sandwith to the Dardanelles, was because outbreaks of disorder were arising, annoying the Turkish authorities in the Dardanelles, annoying the French who were also based there, and causing huge embarrassment to the ambassador whose name was behind this operation. So he sent Skene there to report on this, and the upshot was, and it would take too long to go into this in detail, that Beatson eventually resigned because of his row with the ambassador. And he and the ambassador, in some ways, were very similar. They were priggish, domineering, unused to argument. And when you get two people like this trying to work together and the difference of view emerges, there's usually an explosion, and there was. And eventually, Beatson resigned. Now, one consequence of that was that the Bashi-Bazouks in the Dardanelles were rolled in with a separate force that had already been recruited of regular Turkish cavalry, again under British command and British money, and as the Osmanli irregular cavalry. And it was these people who were all sent off to Bulgaria to spend the winter of 1855 because there was nowhere else to put them, and there was not sufficient fodder, for example, in the Dardanelles. And while it was there was almost total collapse of discipline and a breakdown of order amongst the troops, mainly because the commanding officer was so hopeless. Beatson, of course, having nonsense disappeared. Now, two nice bits flow from this. Firstly, Beatson, the so-called Beatson mutiny, rumours went around and reports were made suggesting that Beatson, anxious not to have to give up his command, had fomented revolt, mutiny amongst his British officers, not to have to join the Osmanli irregular cavalry. Now, mutiny by an officer was a capital offence. He was hanged if he'd been found guilty. He subsequently discovered that the person who had spread this idea and put it in the minds of senior British officers was James Henry Skene, the consul whom Sandwith had gone out to work with. And there ensued, some years later, Skene then in Aleppo, a famous legal case in London in the High Court, in which Beatson sued Skene. Skene won on a technicality, but the finding was quite clear. He should have withdrawn his allegations, but he didn't have sufficient grounds for them. And Skene's reputation was the one that was damaged. But because of the technicality, the legal technicality, Beatson lost, was virtually bankrupted, and had to go on working for years longer than he'd intended to try and keep his funds. So that is in summary, is the story. Quite a lot has been written about it, but because it never involved action against the Russians, and because it never involved regular British troops, it's not one that is told often in this country. But there is material on it that I can pass on to the lady in question.
Just very quick. Did he ever get married?
I beg your pardon. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And I should perhaps have said that right at the beginning, sort of age, he was a deeply Christian man. Christianity pervaded English life in those days, particularly for the middle classes. There is, people here may be surprised to hear about it, a thriving Protestant evangelical church in Khanyat, that to this day traces its roots in a straight line back to the meetings that Sandwith had, prayer and Bible reading meetings that Sandwith held in his house in Kanyal. And he got the marks in his biblical Greek. But yes, he did get married. He was from a big family, 7 of 10. His elder sister went on to have 17 more children. He and his wife, Sandwith and his wife, had 5 children. Large families sometimes killed the woman. They more often broke the health of the woman. Of those 5, 4 were born in 5 years. But in Crete, just as after he arrived, 3 of those 5 children were born in a fraction over 3 years. And his wife's health never really recovered. And they, from the mid-1870s, 5 years after he'd arrived, they effectively led separate lives because she was staying at home. And he pursued his career elsewhere. But yes, he did, and she outlived him actually in the end because of the accident.
Was there one last question?
Would you like to compare the effectiveness of diplomats such as these who lived on the spot and imbued the local knowledge and culture with today's who come and go?
I'm not trying to be tactful here, but no, I think the circumstances are so different. Not least because of Britain's position. You see, assertive is one of the words up there. All consuls were important people in their area. British consuls, particularly so. Every Ottoman provincial governor knew that the British consul had a direct line to London and to the ambassador in Constantinople. And if they went out of line with British policy, the ambassador would be intervening with the Grand Vizier. And they all knew that, and they respected it. And that was an important part of their capacity to influence events on the ground. It's not like that now. So I can't make it. But they could be very effective, as witnessed in Crete, working with an ambassador. Sandwith, but then again was very effective, as he then was in Tunis. And this was because the Ottoman consuls were political agents, acting politically, intervening politically, in a way unlike consuls in any other part of the world, except arguably for the Far East, where consuls also had the local languages. British consuls elsewhere in the world operated in European languages and usually in French.
Okay. Stephen, thank you very much indeed for the talk and for answering those questions. Thank you to our audience here and online. And we look forward to seeing you on the 12th of December if you can. So thank you very much.